On March 16, 1968, an American helicopter descended between armed soldiers and terrified civilians hiding inside My-Lai.
Are you with me? We protect those civilians now, whatever happens when I step outside this helicopter.
We are with you, Pilot Hugh. We will hold our positions and protect everyone inside that bunker.
If those soldiers fire on the civilians or on me, stop them immediately with the M60.
For the first time, American machine guns covered civilians from soldiers wearing the same uniform as their crew.
My-Lai became the darkest American chapter of the war, yet 3 airmen chose conscience over obedience.
Earlier that morning, the crew received routine reconnaissance orders before departing Chu-Lai for Sun Mai.
Command described My-Lai as a fortified enemy position and warned that anyone remaining might be hostile.
Understood, Pilot Hugh. I will watch the fields, tree lines, roads, and rooftops during our first pass.
The observation helicopter lifted from Chu-Lai, carrying 3 airmen toward San Mi and an uncertain battlefield.
American artillery struck the western edge of My-Lai before troop-carrying helicopters approached the surrounding fields.
From the cockpit, Pilot Hugh searched for muzzle flashes, defensive positions, and signs of organized resistance below.
Instead, mothers gathered children, farmers abandoned their tools, and villagers moved urgently toward nearby earthen shelters.
Livestock broke loose between houses while frightened families crossed paths, creating confusion without any organized defense.
Troop-carrying Hueys landed outside the hamlet, and American infantry spread into formation, expecting concealed enemy fire. The soldiers advanced through open lanes, but no shots returned, and no armed Vietnamese units appeared.
Gunner Larry, confirm your sector. I see civilians moving below, but no weapons or organized opposition anywhere nearby.
Confirmed. Character in Image 3, Pilot Hugh. I see families and farmers, but no defensive positions or coordinated movement from either side.
For nearly an hour, the crew followed roads, hedgerows, and tree lines, searching carefully for hostile activity.
With fuel running low, Pilot Hugh turned toward Chu-Lai while continuing to watch the village behind him.
Refuel us quickly. Something is wrong in that village, and I want another low pass immediately.
After refueling, the crew returned immediately, approaching My-Lai beneath a widening column of dark smoke.
Along the roads and irrigation ditch, motionless civilians appeared below, where active fighting had never occurred.
Gunner Larry and Gunner Glenn watched silently as confusion gave way to disbelief and growing alarm inside the aircraft. Pilot Hugh tightened his grip on the controls, resisting the conclusion forming as the helicopter circled lower. Gunner Glenn noticed a wounded Vietnamese woman moving beside the road and immediately directed Pilot Hugh toward her position. Gunner Glenn, prepare colored smoke. Mark her position clearly so the infantry can provide immediate medical assistance.
Gunner Glenn released the marker upwind, allowing colored smoke to drift naturally toward the wounded civilian's location.
Nearby Huey, this is Hugh. We have 1 wounded civilian requiring immediate medical evacuation from My-Lai.
We copy 1 wounded civilian. Ground forces must secure the location before we attempt evacuation.
Captain Medina and several American soldiers noticed the marker and approached the wounded woman while the crew watched above.
The aircrew expected the marked civilian to receive medical help and continued circling to protect the evacuation area.
The wounded woman raised her hand toward Captain Medina, apparently asking the approaching American soldiers for help.
Captain Medina rejected her appeal and fired, destroying the crew's final belief that the violence was accidental.
Inside the helicopter, disbelief turned into certainty as the crew understood that American soldiers were attacking civilians deliberately. Gunner Glenn continued scanning ahead, searching urgently for other civilians who might still be in immediate danger.
Ahead, Gunner Glenn saw American soldiers approaching an earthen bunker where several frightened Vietnamese civilians were hiding.
Pilot Hugh, soldiers are closing on that bunker. I can see civilians trapped inside with nowhere to escape.
Understood, I'm inbound.
Pilot Hugh studied the approaching infantry, the bunker entrance, and the narrow, clear ground separating both groups.
Before descending, Pilot Hugh checked the wind, nearby obstacles, and the soldiers' movement to identify a safe landing path.
Are you both with me? We are going down there before those soldiers reach the civilians. Land the helicopter, and we will protect the civilians from here.
Pilot Hugh reduced speed and began a controlled descent toward the narrow ground separating the soldiers and bunker. Gunner Larry positioned his M60 toward the infantry approach while maintaining strict control and keeping his finger clear. Gunner Glenn covered the opposite approach, carefully keeping his weapon clear of the cockpit and civilian shelter.
The helicopter descended directly across the infantry's path, forcing the soldiers to stop beneath violent rotor wash.
Pilot Hugh settled the helicopter firmly between the bunker and infantry, creating a physical barrier across the narrow approach.
If they move toward the bunker or fire on me, stop the threat immediately and protect those civilians.
Armed only with his sidearm, Pilot Hugh stepped from the helicopter and assessed the soldiers waiting ahead. Pilot Hugh crossed the clearing alone, keeping his hands visible, while both gunners covered him from the helicopter. Commander Brooks waited near the lane while his soldiers watched the pilot, bunker, and helicopter with growing uncertainty.
Commander Brooks, stop your men and help bring the unarmed civilians from that bunker to safety immediately.
The only practical way to remove the civilians was using a grenade.
The only way to bring those people out is to throw a grenade into that bunker.
The lieutenant's response pushed Pilot Hugh beyond disbelief, but he kept his sidearm holstered and his movements controlled.
Do not approach that bunker. Any grenade or gunfire will force my crew to stop you immediately.
Gunner Larry adjusted the mounted M60 toward the infantry while keeping his finger outside the trigger guard.
Gunner Glenn covered the opposite approach, carefully avoiding Pilot Hugh and the bunker entrance with his mounted weapon.
American soldiers hesitated beneath the rotor wash, looking between their commander, the helicopter, and the civilian shelter. Commander Brooks glanced toward both machine guns and understood the aircrew would defend the civilians if necessary.
Tell your men to step backward slowly, lower their rifles, and keep the path completely clear.
The commander finally signaled his soldiers backward, ending the immediate confrontation without a single shot being fired.
Pilot Hugh waited until every rifle moved away before turning carefully toward the dark bunker entrance alone.
Come out slowly. Stay together, keep your hands visible, and walk toward the helicopter without running.
At first, the civilians remained hidden, unable to trust another American soldier standing outside their shelter. Pilot Hugh lowered himself near the entrance, kept his sidearm secured, and repeated the invitation more gently.
You are safe for now. Bring the children first, and we will move everyone away together.
An elderly Vietnamese man appeared first, moving cautiously while Pilot Hugh stepped aside and gave him space. A woman followed with a child. Then more frightened civilians emerged one at a time from the bunker. Pilot Hugh guided the civilians behind the helicopter, using its fuselage as a physical shield from the infantry.
11 civilians now crouched together behind the aircraft, while both gunners maintained disciplined protective positions nearby.
I have 11 civilians requiring evacuation. Send a Huey immediately and prepare to receive frightened passengers.
Evac request, I repeat, evac request. Please respond. The request violated normal procedure.
Pilot Hugh, this landing zone is unsecured. Confirm you accept responsibility for loading civilians under these conditions.
Confirmed. Approach from the east, keep your rotors turning, and remain only long enough to load them.
The rescue Huey approached carefully, while Pilot Hugh organized the civilians outside the dangerous rotor arc nearby. Gunner Larry briefly left his weapon position and helped an elderly man remain steady beneath the downwash. Gunner Glenn stayed aboard the observation helicopter, watching the infantry while keeping the aircraft between both groups.
Keep moving together. Protect the children from the rotor wash and board only when the crew signals.
One by one, all 11 civilians entered the Huey, while Pilot Hugh maintained an orderly loading line.
Without firing, 3 airmen had stopped their comrades and removed 11 civilians from immediate danger that morning. The crew departed without celebration, still struggling to understand everything they had witnessed across My-Lai that morning.
As they crossed the irrigation ditch, Gunner Glenn continued searching below for any sign of surviving civilians.
Pilot Hugh, I saw movement inside that ditch. Turn back now. Someone down there may still be alive.
Pilot Hugh turned immediately, while Gunner Larry carefully maintained visual contact with the ditch during the descending orbit. Hold your positions until we land. Nobody exits before I confirm the rotor and surrounding ground are safe.
The helicopter settled beside the ditch, spreading dust across the road while the crew prepared to search below. Gunner Glenn waited for clearance, then moved carefully beneath the rotor toward the edge of the irrigation ditch. He slowed at the edge, tested the loose soil, and climbed carefully down, using both hands for balance. Inside the ditch, Gunner Glenn searched cautiously, following the faint movement he had noticed from the aircraft.
Beneath an adult's protective body, Gunner Glenn discovered a small Vietnamese boy curled tightly and still breathing.
Gunner Larry and Gunner Glenn carried the child together, moving carefully to avoid causing him further distress. The gunners placed the boy inside, using available equipment to support him safely during the flight.
The strop is secure. Keep him supported during every turn, and watch his breathing until we land.
Once everyone was secured, Pilot Hugh lifted toward Quang Ngai, carrying the rescued child away from My-Lai.
During the flight, Pilot Hugh repeatedly checked the rear cabin while maintaining a steady course toward medical assistance.
Gunner Glenn supported the child against vibration, while Gunner Larry watched the approaching route for possible danger.
Stay with us, little one. We are taking you somewhere safe, and people there will help you.
Hearing the frightened child behind him, Pilot Hugh thought of his own young son waiting back home.
The experienced pilot quietly wept inside the cockpit, yet maintained complete control throughout the urgent flight. Quang Ngai Medical Station, we have one surviving child aboard. Prepare immediate care beside your landing area.
Circled once, confirmed the landing space was clear, and descended beside the Quang Ngai Hospital. Pilot Hugh helped carry the child toward the hospital, while medical workers cleared a direct path inside.
We will care for him now. You brought him here alive, and that gives everyone hope today.
Pilot Hugh watched the child disappear into treatment, then returned toward his helicopter carrying anger instead of relief.
Returning to Chu Lai, Pilot Hugh completed the shutdown and walked directly toward his platoon commander in fury.
This operation is pointless. I will tear off this insignia and never fly again if it continues.
This is not combat. Unarmed civilians are being killed, and Command must stop every unit inside My-Lai now.
I will tear off this insignia and never fly again if Command allows the killing to continue. The force of Pilot Hugh's protest compelled his commander to forward the report through increasingly alarmed command channels. Task Force Command, urgent aircrew report. Civilians are being attacked inside My-Lai despite no organized enemy resistance.
The report reached Commander Barker while conflicting battlefield messages continued arriving from units operating throughout My-Lai.
All units inside My-Lai, cease fire immediately. Hold your positions and await further instructions from Task Force Command.
Operators repeated the ceasefire across overloaded channels until every platoon confirmed receiving the command from headquarters. American soldiers heard the command through crackling radios and gradually stopped moving deeper into the village.
Hold here! Lower your rifles and do not advance until Task Force Command confirms our next movement.
The belated ceasefire ended organized shooting only after hundreds of Vietnamese civilians had already lost their lives.
For the first time that morning, My-Lai became quieter beneath smoke, hovering aircraft, and broken radio traffic.
Collect every flight report, radio log, and infantry statement before anyone leaves the operational area today.
We saw civilians throughout the village, but no enemy formations, defensive positions, or weapons directed toward American forces.
I covered him because armed soldiers continued approaching civilians after he ordered them to stop and withdraw.
We marked a wounded woman for assistance, then watched American soldiers approach instead of providing medical help.
The 3 aircrew accounts matched closely, making it difficult for commanders to dismiss their testimony as battlefield confusion. Do not discuss My-Lai outside official channels. Command will decide what happened and who receives these reports.
I will not remain silent while innocent civilians are blamed for what American soldiers did inside that village.
After the incident, commanders restricted information and attempted to contain the aircrew's account within internal military channels.
Early official summaries minimized civilian deaths and avoided describing the helicopter crew's confrontation with American infantry.
The 3 airmen left the debriefing, knowing that military silence was already closing around their testimony.
3 weeks after My-Lai, Glenn received another combat assignment, while the investigation remained hidden from public view.
Gunner Glenn prepared with familiar care, checking every harness connection before another mission over contested terrain.
Stay careful up there, Gunner Glenn. We still need every witness who knows what happened inside My-Lai.
Gunner Glenn's helicopter lifted from the base and joined another combat operation beyond Chu Lai.
During the operation, the helicopter suddenly lost stable flight, forcing the crew to react above rising terrain.
Hold the aircraft level! We are losing altitude quickly, and the tree line is directly ahead!
The helicopter vanished behind the trees, followed by a heavy impact and an abrupt loss of radio contact. Nearby crews circled the area, calling repeatedly for survivors while smoke rose through the trees below. Had died during the helicopter crash 3 weeks after My-Lai.
Pilot Hugh understood that one of the 3 direct witnesses to My-Lai was now permanently silent.
Gunner Larry struggled with the loss, remembering Gunner Glenn's courage beside the bunker and inside the irrigation ditch.
When journalists uncovered My-Lai, photographs and eyewitness accounts shattered the official description of a successful combat operation. The My-Lai story spread rapidly through the press, shocking the United States and audiences throughout the world.
Pilot Hugh stepped forward to testify, knowing his account could damage careers, reputations, and his own future.
We observed civilians throughout My-Lai, but saw no organized resistance, enemy formations, or weapons directed toward American forces.
We marked a wounded woman for assistance, expecting nearby American soldiers to protect and evacuate her immediately.
Captain Medina approached the wounded civilian, rejected her appeal for help, and fired while our crew watched overhead. Why did you land between American soldiers and civilians without first requesting permission from the ground commander? The soldiers were advancing. The civilians had nowhere to escape, and waiting for permission would have cost lives. Did you order your gunners to fire if American soldiers attacked you or the civilians inside that bunker? I ordered my crew to protect the Vietnamese civilians in our position at any cost, sir. Yes. I ordered them to protect the civilians and stop anyone who opened fire on innocent people.
Gunner Larry entered afterward and confirmed the confrontation from his position behind the helicopter's mounted M60 machine gun.
My weapon covered the infantry, but my finger remained clear until an immediate threat appeared before us. Did Pilot Hugh appear confused, panicked, or unable to make rational decisions during the bunker confrontation?
No. He remained controlled, issued clear instructions, and placed himself between armed soldiers and defenseless civilians.
Gunner Glenn found a surviving child inside the ditch, and together we carried him back to our helicopter.
Gunner Glenn could not testify, but the surviving crew described his courage and essential role in saving the child.
Investigators compared radio logs, photographs, and testimony to identify officers involved in directing or permitting the killings.
Captain Medina later faced military proceedings, but prosecutors struggled to establish his direct responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. His defense argued that Captain Medina neither ordered unlawful killings nor understood every soldier's actions throughout My-Lai. The military court acquitted Captain Medina, leaving many observers convinced that senior responsibility had escaped punishment. The lieutenant became the only individual convicted for criminal actions committed during the My-Lai massacre.
Their testimony made both airmen publicly recognizable, but recognition brought hostility instead of immediate gratitude or respect.
I testified because civilians were killed, and soldiers remain responsible for the orders they choose to follow.
The hearings ended, but Pilot Hugh's most isolated years began, as public anger turned directly against him.
After leaving Vietnam, Pilot Hugh received insulting letters, anonymous threats, and accusations that he had betrayed America.
The lasting trauma damaged Pilot Hugh's personal life, and his marriage eventually ended beneath years of emotional strain. He also lost contact with Gunner Larry, the only surviving crewmate who fully understood what they had endured.
In November 1983, Pilot Hugh left military service and moved toward a quieter life in Broussard, Louisiana. In Louisiana, Pilot Hugh lived quietly and worked an ordinary job, rarely speaking publicly about My-Lai.
Gunner Larry moved to Georgia, and both men searched unsuccessfully for each other during 16 long years apart.
In 1988, journalist Bilton and his British film crew painstakingly located both surviving members of the helicopter crew.
Pilot Hugh, we found Gunner Larry in Georgia. He has also been trying to locate you for years. Larry? Oh my God! Larry? Oh my God, it's him!
After 16 years apart, Pilot Hugh and Gunner Larry finally stood face to face through journalist Bilton's efforts.
When journalist Bilton's documentary aired in 1989, the aircrew's actions reached a broad audience for the first time.
The documentary deeply moved the professor, who began a demanding campaign seeking official recognition for the three airmen. For 3 difficult years, Professor Egan wrote dozens of letters demanding medals and justice for the My-Lai helicopter crew.
30 years after My-Lai, Pilot Hugh, Gunner Larry, and Gunner Glenn finally received the Soldier's Medal for Extraordinary Courage. I will accept this medal only if Gunner Larry and Gunner Glenn receive equal recognition for their courage.
The Pentagon agreed, honoring Gunner Larry beside him and awarding Gunner Glenn the medal posthumously before the assembled crowd. Less than 1 week later, Pilot Hugh and Gunner Larry returned to Vietnam with journalist Mike and an American television crew.
We came back to honor the victims, not to defend ourselves or erase what happened here.
On March 15, 1998, they met Victim Nhung and Victim Yang, 2 civilians rescued from the bunker 3 decades earlier.
We remembered the helicopter, the dust, and the men who stood between us and the soldiers that morning.
We never forgot you. Every year afterward, we wondered whether anyone from that bunker had survived.
After returning home, both veterans received thousands of supportive letters from Americans who finally understood their actions.
In autumn 1998, the University of Connecticut awarded both men honorary doctorates for courage and moral leadership.
They later traveled to Norway for the Falstad Human Rights Conference, sharing their experience with an international audience.
A soldier's duty does not end with orders.
Conscience must remain present when innocent lives are threatened.
Pilot Hugh died in 2006, remembered by friends as a man still haunted by those he could not save.
In 2008, journalist Bilton and gunner Larry returned to Saint-Denis during production of a French film about the massacre. We must remember Saint-Denis not to preserve hatred, but to prevent such crimes from happening anywhere again.
In 2009, Gunner Larry established the Hugh Thompson Foundation, raising support for Saint-Denis and Vietnam's poorest communities. The foundation carries his name because his courage must continue serving the people he tried to protect. Its work supported education, community development, and humanitarian assistance in regions still carrying the long consequences of war. Across decades, the meaning of their decision expanded beyond one helicopter, one village, or one military investigation.
Their actions demonstrated that military discipline loses legitimacy when obedience requires abandoning humanity.
We were soldiers that morning, but our first responsibility was to remain human when others would not.
Whenever Mỹ-Lai is remembered, Pilot Hugh, Gunner Larry, and Gunner Glenn remain enduring symbols of conscience, dignity, and courage.
Their legacy asks every generation a difficult question. What will you do when lawful authority abandons basic humanity?
Subscribe to 102 Hub for more cinematic war documentaries revealing the decisions, sacrifices, and human stories history cannot forget.
Thank you for watching. Share this story and join 102 Hub as we continue uncovering history beyond the battlefield.